This is Podco Media Networks.
It's the Innovation Podcast with Mark Reed Edwards and Garnett Harriman. Let's start the show.
Hi, it's Mark. Garnett and I have had some great discussions we can't wait to share with you. This week and next, we feature Mark Gallagher, a renowned figure in the world of F1. Soon we'll have Tommy Williams, who runs the startup food company Tommy's Superfoods. John Finley, who is reviving the great 1970s and 80s brand Underalls, will join us to tell us all about that. Carmela Ray, who founded the Egg Fund, focused on helping people finance fertility treatments, will join us soon to discuss that important topic. And we're also talking with Boston University Innovation Fellow Moira Kelly, Michael Hoffman, founder and CEO at Gather Voices, and Jarrett C. Riddick, director of the U.S. Army's Vehicle Technology Directorate. Plus, we have some special things planned for the new year. Well, let's get to our discussion now with Mark Gallagher, who has been around the world of F1 for decades. In this episode, we learn about Mark's background and career, how data is driving F1, as well as innovations around driver safety. So let's get to it. Mark, it's great having you here to discuss one of my favorite subjects, F1.
Pleasure to be joining you, especially after all this time when we used to speak to each other 20 years ago.
Exactly. So you've had a whole career since then, but tell me about your career path, from when you started to how you got to this point.
So I came out of university in 1983, which seems such a long time ago. And I was very lucky to go straight into auto racing, working for a publication in London called Autosport magazine. And I spent 7 years working in the media. So I was a journalist, I was a broadcaster, I worked for BBC Radio, I worked for Eurosport Television, which was at that time a satellite channel in Europe, and then kind of began to jump away from working in the media to working on the commercial side of the sport. So I consulted for Philip Morris for 5 years. This was parallel to being a journalist. So I was kind of earning a small amount of money as a journalist and a lot of money as a media consultant. And so working with Philip Morris and some of their brands who were sponsoring the sport. And then as a result of a lot of that kind of work, I got to know everyone in the sport and was asked by a guy called Eddie Jordan, who's a fellow Irishman. I'm from the northern part of Ireland. Eddie is from Dublin. He asked me if I would like to join his new Formula One team in 1990. And I worked with Eddie from 1990 all the way through until 2004. I then joined what I thought was a rather strange Austrian company called Red Bull. We decided to buy a Formula One team called Jaguar, and that became Red Bull Racing. And my last executive role in Formula One was running Cosworth as an engine supplier, which I did sort of 2010 onwards for a couple of years. So that was kind of been my Formula One career. The other big piece of my career, which I won't go into all the kind of chronology, but at a particular point when I came out of Red Bull Racing, I founded my own race team outside of Formula One. Its name was Status Grand Prix, and we competed in a thing called A1 Grand Prix, which was like the World Cup of Motorsport, and we competed in that for 4 seasons with these 600 brake horsepower single-seater cars built by Lola and Dallara, and we won that championship in 2009, and then I moved the team into the 2 feeder formula to Formula One. So we did GP3 and GP2. And that team continued for a decade. And then with my shareholders, we all felt we had done as much as we could. So we sold the team and that was it. So that's been the other sort of big part of my racing career. And then the last 8 years, I've been doing this very strange thing of working with lots of Formula One race car drivers, bringing them into corporations around the world as a public speaker myself, and bringing these top talents into corporate audiences. And I can't believe how exciting it's been. It's been an amazing time. And most weeks I'm traveling somewhere to speak at a conference and talk about, Formula One from not so much from a sporting point of view, mainly from a business perspective.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting story that the listeners would really enjoy hearing about the Jordan F1 team from the 1990s, this insurgent kind of rabble of nonconformists, right? And Eddie Jordan certainly being the lead one there. Can you tell us what that was like from the early 90s to when I met you in like 1998 or 1999, when the team was surging and almost won a world championship?
Yeah, it was such an exciting time. And I think there's no doubt that as I've gotten older, I look back and I've really come to the conclusion that when young folks are in their kind of heyday, you know, when they're having like the key moments in their career, you're too busy to realize it. And we had quite a special experience. So the Jordan Formula One team grew out of a race team which had been competing in lower categories. And so Eddie Jordan Racing, as it was called, had been competing in Formula 3 and Formula 3000, which these days is called Formula 2. And he had been doing that for 10 years. And Eddie had been a race car driver, and he had discovered he was quite good at driving, but really good at raising sponsorship. And so that's what he focused on. So he got out of the driving business and he got into the business. So he just started raising funding for drivers and for his team, and he was very successful. And he developed the careers of a number of notable Formula One race car drivers, such as John O'Lacey, who went on to drive for Ferrari, and Eddie Irvine, who became Michael Schumacher's teammate at Ferrari. And so he was buying and selling drivers, and he was a driver manager. So when I joined Eddie, I'd gotten to know him over the 1980s, and he had raised just enough money to build one Formula One car. And as an entrepreneur, he took the ultimate risk. He put all his money into creating a prototype product. And it was just a Jordan Formula One car. And he used the fact that he had a product to go and sell out to some sponsors. So really we came into Formula One in 1991. Our very first Formula One race was in the United States in Phoenix, Arizona. And we competed in Formula One in 1991 and finished fifth in the World Championship at our first attempt. And this is back in the days when there were 18 Formula One teams. So we were fifth out of 18 teams in our first season. So we did a kind of disruptive, giant killing act, and it raised a lot of eyebrows. And if you want to know the backstory to that early success, it was a classic small team startup, everyone doing 5 different jobs. We didn't know what we didn't know, so we just got on with it. And I think, like a lot of businesses, we just didn't fall into a complacent position. We were trying new things. And so that was very exciting. And really, that was the catalyst. 1991, that first season, led to Jordan becoming a very attractive proposition. The team was regarded as competitive. It attracted drivers, it attracted sponsors, and we worked really hard to be different from the competition. So we set out from the get-go, we really set out to have a positioning that was different. You know, this small, Irish-owned, agile Formula One team, and we embraced the media big time. So we realized that, you know, we probably weren't going to win the World Championship, but if you're not going to win the World Championship, why not win the hearts and minds of fans and media Monday to Friday by being as open and friendly as possible. So really built a head of steam around that kind of open mentality, and it was just terrific. And led by Eddie, and he's referred to by people as a maverick and a kind of showman, and he's all those things. He is maverick and he is a showman, but at his heart, he's passionate about racing, and a classic entrepreneur who mortgaged everything to make a success out of it, and then employed people like myself to come in and help him to achieve his dreams. And it felt inspirational to be working with someone whose name was over the front door of the business, and he ate and slept and worked Formula One, and he wanted all of us to do the same. So it was very exciting.
Yeah. Just a frame of reference, back in those days, how many people worked for the Ferrari team and how many people worked for Jordan, would you think?
So in our first season in Formula One, we got ready for the season with a staff of 50. And I think as the year progressed, we kind of went up to about 60 into season 2. And I distinctly remember Eddie saying, if I ever employ 100 people, I won't be running the company because I could never run a business. I could never run a race team with 100 people. 8 years later, we had 300 staff. So, so that was Jordan. Ferrari, when we raced Ferrari first in 1991, Ferrari would have had, I guess, kind of 500 staff. So like 10 times as many as we did. But that quickly accelerated as the sport became more complex in terms of aerodynamics and material science and digitalization. And so by the time we had 300, Ferrari had 1,000 staff.
Yeah.
So that gives you a measure of the difference.
Yeah, Ferrari and Mercedes today have on the order of 2,000 people, I think, working for them.
Yeah, so I hear these figures. I think it's slightly inaccurate because there's actually 1,000 people who work for Mercedes-Benz Formula One team in the town of Brackley, which is about 8 miles from my home. And then there are another 500 people who work for the Mercedes-Benz powertrain division in Northampton. Yeah. But that division doesn't just do Formula One. They do lots of other projects. So exclusively in Formula One, probably 1,200. If you include all of the people in Northampton, maybe 1,500 people. And I think at Ferrari, it's less, actually. I think, Ferrari's headcount is less than Mercedes. They do everything in-house. But then their powertrain division, the Formula One powertrain division, pretty well works exclusively in Formula One. So they're not doing other projects, so they don't need to employ more people to do that. But, whatever way you look at it, it's kind of between 1,000 and 1,500 people, which is a lot of folks to put 2 race cars on the track 21 times a year.
I just wanted to kind of give a frame of reference for what you were up against in the 1990s. I mean, it's a David and Goliath kind of thing back then. And today, any team coming into the sport faces an even greater challenge. Indeed.
I think again, going back to my comment that we didn't know what we didn't know, we came into Formula One with a small, very tiny team of people, kind of family team. If I recall the figures correctly, I think we budgeted for £6.5 million sterling. So that's about like $8.5 million or $8 million, depending what way the currency markets are. So yeah, it was kind of felt like about $8 million was our budget. We then spent 12. So we ended up, we sort of quit. By the end of year one, we were, kind of 4 million in debt. And that was kind of the beginning of us learning what it is that we didn't know. So we didn't realize just how expensive this business is. And by the time I met you and Jordan had reached the end of the 1990s and was a competitive team, we were working on a budget of about $140 million a year. So that gives you an idea, just colossal increase in spend. But then the major teams, when we were racing with, $8 to $12 million of spend, they were racing with 80 to 100 million, the big teams. And then by the time we were spending $140 million a year, the big teams were telling us they were spending $350-400 million dollars a year. And, I've always taken the view that the big teams, dollar for dollar, don't give as much value as the smaller teams because we spend our money very carefully. But there's no question that to some extent, having a bigger budget like the large teams do have means that they can try more things, and if stuff doesn't work, it doesn't really matter because they just move on. They have other development programs. When you're a smaller team, you can't afford for things not to work. So research and development projects in a small team are very carefully thought through before we ever go spending money on them. But it is a David and Goliath situation, and I think we loved that. Actually, I think we didn't complain about it. We quite liked. It's in some ways, it's nice to be the challenger brand. It's nice to be the little guy because as a little guy, if you deliver, people are amazed and they go, that's just amazing. You've done such a giant killing act. And if you don't deliver, people go, oh, well, they don't have the resources and the people. So it's kind of, in some ways, a slightly less pressurized position to be in. Yeah. And you can exceed expectations easily. Yeah. I think in that 1991 season, we didn't realize at the time just how amazing it was. But if you consider that back in 1991, there were 4 giant teams in the sport. There was Ferrari, there was McLaren, there was Williams, and there was Benetton. And we finished behind them. And so we beat everyone else. And that included teams like Lotus, who'd been around for like ever. And it included, famous teams with people with much more money and huge amounts of experience. And it was because of this kind of family run, dynamic, entrepreneurial startup mentality, trying new stuff. And that just set us on a path into what then developed over the next decade.
I want to talk about data a little bit. In America, we've got baseball and there's statistics around that, the NFL, the NBA, all that. They all generate data on player performance. But I think F1 probably as a sport is more data-driven than any of those sports. And how has the access to data and the use of it changed in the sport over the time you've been involved?
I think one of the most pleasing aspects of starting my career in 1983 in Formula One is that I pretty well caught the beginning of digitalization, because essentially what happened in the mid-80s was mechanical systems, in terms of mechanical injection, fuel injection on the vehicles, began to become electronic. And as you went from mechanical to electronic systems, suddenly we found we had little microprocessors in electronic control units, and all of a sudden we were dealing with software. And it's incredible to think is that really back in the late 80s, people were playing around with moving information and controlling engines using software tools back then, very rudimentary, of course. And also, I actually heard recently an extraordinary story from Alan Jones, who won the World Championship in 1981. And he explained about going to Ferrari and to have a meeting. And Ferrari were showing him that, and this is in the early 80s, they were showing him that they had set up these beams across the track. So the car would break a beam at its entry to the corner, and then midway through the corner, and then at its exit. So there would be a beam at the midpoint, the entry and the exit. And they would then time that, and then it would give them sort of basic information about the car's velocity and this kind of thing. So it's been, Formula One really embraced getting hold of information at a very early stage. It just took off from the late 80s onwards. And as I often explain, initially we had onboard data systems to gather performance data, like how's the car behaving, how are we doing at any point in time. So we'd plug an umbilical cable into the car and download data when it would come back into the pits, and kind of learn some interesting stuff. And then we started wireless, microwave technology arrived, and we started having these bursts of data that we could download, and that was really cool. But whenever I speak about this topic, I make the point that things really began to change in a significant way in 1994 when we had two fatalities at the San Marino Grand Prix in Italy. And the reason I kind of seize on that point is that those two fatal accidents of Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna led to the governing body of the sport realizing the benefits of having data, because the information, the performance data that had been recorded on the vehicles suddenly became really useful for analyzing what had gone wrong. So suddenly data as a way of managing risk entered the mindset of everyone. And really from that moment onwards, 25 years ago, it's been a data-driven environment. How can we gather data and then mine that data to optimize performance, manage risk, drive quality of outcomes? And it's just been turbocharged, data-driven performance ever since. And you end up with a sport today, which, is 30 years into embracing a fully connected environment, and it's fully data-centric. And that's had many, many, many positive benefits and some questionable outcomes, but overall, it's been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah. So what are the ways in which teams use data to compete and extract, data nuggets that help them perform better in, the coming race, or evaluate the success of a previous race? How do they use it?
So the car is fully instrumented. So depending on who you speak to any given weekend, they'll tell you there's 220 sensors or 250 sensors, but there'll be however many sensors they need on systems that are moving vibrating have a pressure or a temperature or a flow. So, any liquids, whether it's hydraulic pressures or fuel pressures or water system or, whatever it happens to be. So you've got all these sensors and they're gathering data and transmitting that data real time to the team. Obviously, all the driver inputs are being recorded. So the driver turning the steering wheel, pressing the pedals, changing the gear shift, all of those changes are being monitored and recorded real time. And how that becomes useful to the team is we quickly build up a picture of how our product is performing. And as you can imagine, most of the time the data is telling us that everything's pretty good. So what we're really interested in are the anomalies and the areas where it's maybe not performing. So the engineers who've designed the vehicle will have an idea of how each system should be performing. So if we see system degradation or an issue develop, we want to jump on that and find out how we can better optimize our outcomes. During a Formula One, when the car is on racetrack, the data is being looked at by data analysts at their track side. So we will have around about 6 to 8 data analysts per car. So they're sitting at workstations looking at all the different systems on the car and how they're performing real time. And those data analysts can then work with the engineers in the garage and on the pit wall to make sure that we're managing the vehicle as best possible during the race. The data is also being transferred simultaneously back to headquarters, and back in a team's headquarters, they will have, or anywhere between 40 and 50 engineers and race strategists and software engineers actually monitoring everything real time wherever the car is in the world. And the purpose of that kind of mission control environment is that they're getting all the data from both our cars because each team has a 2-car team. So the mission control are looking at the big picture of both our cars, and they're also running software models of our competitors. So we're modeling we're always modeling our performance against our competitors, what we think Ferrari are going to be doing or Mercedes or whoever it happens to be. So the reality is the data is being crunched using algorithms, which are then punching out strategy decisions for us. So it's giving us the ability to optimize decision making and not leave it down to an engineer with pencil behind his ear trying to deal with all of these variables, which is how we used to do it in the old days. So essentially you've got this very data-driven environment where folks at the racetrack and folks back at factory are managing the product real time. And then what essentially occurs is that the senior strategists can relay their decisions back to the team leadership on the pit wall, and the team leadership can radio the driver and say the equivalent of, Houston, we have a problem, or actually we have a good solution for you, or we need to optimize our strategy by having an extra pit stop, or we need you to drive faster or slower or reset a system. And so we can talk the driver through all the scenarios that he or she needs in order to get the performance that we want. And people will inevitably say, why don't we simply send data to the car? Why don't we just upload some fixes, or why don't we send some information to the car remotely? We're not permitted to, so the regulator forbids data transmission to the vehicle. We're only allowed to receive data from it. So that's kind of the circle of data information while the car is on the racetrack. But then when you zoom back out, what else do we do with it? Well, of course, the great thing is that, once the car is finished running on the racetrack, we can take that data back into our systems. And for example, we can run our simulator back in the factory, and we can take what's happened to the car on the racetrack that day, and we can get the driver in our simulator to drive the car with that setup that's identical to the real car. So this is essentially where you're creating a digital twin. So we're using the digital twin in the virtual environment to mirror what's happening in the real world. And then we make changes to that digital twin. So during a Friday evening or even Saturday evening, we can make changes to the digital twin, which then gives us improvements in performance. And when we see those improvements in performance in the simulated environment, we can then literally upload those changes to the team at the racetrack and say, okay, so these are the changes you need to make in order to make the car go faster tomorrow. So there's this dynamic between headquarters and the team out in the field using this information, using the digital twin that we have in order to optimize outcomes for the team. So you've got, that in essence is the use of data during weekends. Once we get away from a weekend, then you've got this vast amount of information which can be mined for, lots of other takeaways that we want to have around, quality, reliability, lifing of systems, product lifecycle management. And this is again where under the iceberg of Formula One, we have this huge progress that has been made possible because of digitalization. So if you take something like quality as a metric, in 2000, the average Formula One car broke down 45% of the time. So average Formula One car, year 2000, 55% of the time it finished the race, 45% of the time it didn't. Today, the top teams are into over 95% reliability. So the quality has been just seen a seismic change. And that's because we have the data to better manage product lifecycle, make sure the quality is there from the get-go, diagnose issues quicker, and we just avoid all the catastrophic failures that we used to have in the past. So, huge impact on the sport and our ability to perform.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I think one of the key innovations in the sport has been around driver safety. What kind of impact has that had on the sport in recent years? When we look back on the accident that involved Senna 25 years ago and all the changes since then, and while there have been, horrific accidents and very occasional deaths in the sport, it's not nearly as common as it used to be.
This is a fact, and it's one of the more dramatic and positive outcomes, which should actually give us all faith in what technology is ultimately doing for society. Because in Formula One, between 1950 and 1994, we had over 40 driver fatalities. We also had many spectator fatalities where cars went into the grandstands and debris would fly into the grandstand. So really that period of 1950 to 1994 was a catalogue of catastrophes. Some years we didn't have any fatalities, other years we had several. And as you rightly point out, the Senna fatality was a key point. And it's interesting to consider why that was. I think one of the reasons was that when you had a fatality in the 50s or 60s or even into the 70s, it didn't get shown on television, and you maybe read about it in the newspaper 2 days later. And I think it was remote from the audience. When Senna was killed in 1994, it was live on television, and we didn't have a delay in the broadcast in those days. So we have a delay now of a few seconds. So there was no delay. So what people saw was absolutely real-time imagery, including some quite distasteful images that were shown. So the world saw that fatality, and it was replayed on CNN and in the Sky, the beginning of rolling news channels, and there was even the beginnings of the web. And I remember distinctly feeling our world had changed, that this was something that was in the public domain and under a huge amount of scrutiny. Since 1994, we've had one further fatality in a Formula One event. So that's more than 40 in 45 years, and then one in the last 25 years. So that's a big change. Yeah. And the fatality that happened in 2014, well, actually, Jules Bianchi, he died in the summer of 2015, but he suffered the head injury in 2014 in Japan. That was a failure of lots of different systems and processes and some poor decision making by a range of folks on that day. And it served to remind us that you've never cracked the risk management problem. But we've made a huge amount of progress, and digitalization has played such a key role in that, because we have the data from everything that goes wrong. We can analyze it forensically, and we know what, for example, leads to a human being losing their life in a race car accident. Because we build the cars from carbon fiber these days, we tend not to get the injuries that drivers had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we don't get crush injuries. So we don't have aluminum chassis that are crumpling around the driver. We don't have aluminum fuel tanks exploding. All of that's gone. So we've got these incredibly strong carbon fiber safety cells with these Kevlar fuel tanks. So actually what happened was we stopped breaking bones, and we moved into a much more significant area of investigation, which was that the driver would suffer very serious internal injuries because the organs in the body are continuing to move at the speed the car was moving at when it hits a stationary object. So you'd have serious concussions, brain injuries, spinal injuries, organ injuries, internal organ. So then a lot of the focus moved on to, okay, so we've got the data from this. So how do we dissipate energy in an accident? And this is where you have this data-driven design environment where you actually design the car to self-destruct in a planned way such that the human being inside the car is fully protected. And at no point does that driver have to withstand all of the energy of the impact. So the energy is being dissipated around lots of different structures: side impact protection, rear impact protection, frontal impact protection, and some very simple but very clever devices developed as a result of understanding these issues. So there was a professor at Michigan, not Institute of Technology, but Michigan State University. He was a biomechanical engineer, Professor Hubbard, and he developed the head and neck safety system, the HANS device, in the 1990s. And he developed that actually as a result of an accident in powerboat racing. But it had an application for car racing. And my close associate, David Coulthard, who raced in Formula One for 15 years, he participated in the development of that. So that's a very simple collar which wraps around the driver's neck. Goes underneath the seat belts. It's made from carbon fiber. It tethers the helmet to the collar, so the helmet and the head cannot rotate during an accident. So that means you don't suffer the rotational injuries. And it also spreads the impact and the loads of the deceleration across the entire torso rather than simply on the neck. So that head and neck safety system, which, you can buy for, a few $100s, has saved, I would say dozens of lives in racing, and certainly in Formula One, it has been one of the biggest steps forward. But when you look at all of these improvements, when you look at the design of safety systems, and when you look at the improved integrity of the vehicles and the way in which we can protect the driver, whatever happens, even in multiple impact accidents, it all comes back to the fact that we have the information. So again, data has unlocked the answer to the question of what's happening, and then how can we reverse engineer from those outcomes so that it doesn't reoccur. So it's been a really very pleasing thing to witness from within the sport, and we undoubtedly have a much safer sport as a result, and it has benefits to road users all around the world, because Formula One's progress in terms of understanding how to prevent fatalities in high energy impacts has been exported into car manufacturers starting in Europe, and it's led to, this is why cars today have got so many safety systems and crash structures embedded within them. It can in some ways all be traced back to that fateful day when Ayrton Senna lost his life in San Marino.
All right, next time we're back with Mark as we focus on other innovations in the sport, the blurring of the technology-human connection, esports, and other big trends. See you then.
Thanks for joining Garnett and Mark on the Innovation Podcast. Visit theinnovationpodcast.co to subscribe and listen to other episodes.